Ali Reza Hashemi from Press TV newsroom. Joining us in our Tehran studio, and Tony Gosling, historian and investigative journalist, joining us from Bristol. Tony, I know you've been on for quite some time. Thanks for your patience, waiting for us to get around to welcoming you, and welcome. Hope you're safe and doing well out there in Bristol. Your initial thoughts, Tony, what is the Israeli regime after, when it has so many opportunities to put an end to the genocide in Gaza, get its captives out, get its troops out of Gaza, allow Gazans to rebuild? No, but it opts for what? More escalation. Why?
Well, first of all, I would like to salute the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, there for his brave, because there are powerful forces within the UN who are undermining much of what's going on for the Israelis. Threats, for example, against those people in the International Court of Justice, direct threats to their families for those who are trying to implement international law of genocide against Israel during this nearly a year now of genocide. But what is motivating Netanyahu and the Israelis? Good question. These people are terrorists. They are basically maniacs in charge of a nuclear armed country. Much of the criticism in the Western press, which seems to be very biased towards Israel, it certainly seems to be, and lots of stories are just simply not covered or exaggerated. We get a lot of criticism of Hezbollah, saying, oh, it's a terrorist organization, because in some countries in the West it is classed as that, even though, of course, it's actually a political party with an armed wing and completely legitimate. It's part of the ruling politicians of Lebanon, completely and utterly legitimate, certainly in the country's defense as part of the National Armed Forces. But people forget that the now security minister in Israel, Ben-Gvir, part of this Kaham party and in the coalition with Netanyahu, most people would argue more extreme, more of a terrorist than Netanyahu himself in this the far-right bloc Israeli cabinet and government committing this genocide. The Kaham party in the United States up until 2022 was proscribed as a terrorist organization. They were actually part of the same group which was the Jewish Defense League, which in Britain and the United States was classed as a terrorist organization, criminalized by the British and the United States governments. Anyone who was part of it, as Ben-Gvir is, would have been arrested and jailed just simply for being a member. So we're hearing all about these so-called terrorists in Lebanon who are basically just defending their country as part of a political party. But we're not hearing in the Western press anything about the terrorists who are now running Israel. Also interesting that, let's try and get to the motives. The question you asked me about the motives. A lot of people are juggling around various ideas, and I think some are bogus, some are closer to the truth, some saying this is just about the land, the holy real estate, the sacred real estate of the monotheistic faiths, particularly Jerusalem itself as a city, controlling this land being so important. Others are saying really this is just a creation of war to make money, and there's a lot of sense in that in terms of the arms companies' shares, and the viability of those arms businesses has been going through the roof ever since this started. A lot of the arms, of course, being shipped from the West and Britain and from the United States to the Israelis, and many of the protests now here on the streets in Britain and even in our political circles and in the press are focusing on stopping this supply of arms. Because let's see why. Because if you look at what's actually going on the ground, the Israelis are really reluctant, I think, despite the propaganda, to send actual troops into Lebanon because it's much cheaper in terms of human lives for them to use the US satellite intelligence to just lob more and more of these munitions. They're buying from the United States with American money, by the way, buying these high-tech munitions, firing them from aircraft and from the ground, and using the US National Security Agency, NSA, satellite targeting information. This is cheaper for them in terms of human lives. They can kill more Lebanese without risking so many Israeli lives. And so that's why this quest in the West amongst ordinary people, which I like to say I represent most people in Britain, in abhorring this genocide, being disgusted by the behavior of Israel, but then throwing up my hands about why are my politicians supporting it. And yeah, so coming back to your question, why are they doing this? Is it about this? Is it about oil? Is it about water? Is it about money? I think actually it's a far more sinister plan. It's spelt out by Albert Pike back in 1871, of all things, where they're actually saying we want to create a fake religious war between genuine Islam and fake Judaism. This is what his plan was. This Grand Master of the Scottish Rite Freemasonry in the United States, and he sent this plan to his colleague who was busy forming the mafia over in Italy, saying that they wanted to create this war in order to discredit the monotheistic faiths these Scottish Rite Masons so hated and found. And this was part of, I think, a plan which the British were involved in with the sort of Second Crusade to take over in Israel. So that's their motivation, I think.
Right. Let us. We're there at the UN Security Council immediate emergency session, addressing the situation in Lebanon. We're on day 3 of unrelenting Israeli airstrikes on Lebanese people that have resulted in over 560 fatalities, including 50 children, 100 women, over 2,000 Lebanese injured, over 500,000 displaced in just 3 days. A number of world leaders there imploring an immediate cessation of hostilities, a full withdrawal of Israeli forces from Lebanese territory, and also an immediate ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. Tony, we don't have much time. I was going to give a recap, but I'd rather get your final thoughts. We only have a couple minutes, Tony. Thank you for your patience. The entire world, so many world leaders at the General Assembly, it was all about Gaza. Immediate ceasefire, get your captives, go home. Here we are at the UN Security Council, immediate demand, immediate cessation of hostilities in Lebanon. But seriously, who is listening in Tel Aviv and Washington when the entire world is speaking against you?
Well, it's not the entire world, because many of the Five Eyes intelligence countries, you know, the British, the Canadians, the Australians, have been saying things, although not the New Zealanders, in support. And last week's vote at the UN General Assembly was really a watershed, a historic watershed, where you had more than 2/3 majority against the abstainers and the voters against the ceasefire, the condemners of Israel. It was a very successful UN vote, and I think the UN is almost finding its feet. It'd be nice to see the Chinese taking the initiative actually at the UN Security Council and insisting on some kind of peacekeeping force in Gaza, you know, something along the lines of what the NATO countries did in the former Yugoslavia back in the 1990s, although that was of course very nefarious. But look, this shows, this whole episode, the desperation of Israel shows that the West's oligarchy is in crisis, is actually that it's very weak, particularly the Biden administration with this Alzheimer's president in its last sort of dying days, with no actual decisive president anywhere near power, with the deep state really running the show in alliance with the Israelis. So it shows the weakness of the West, I think. Gaza quite clearly is the key, if you can stop things there. So I'd like to see if, you know, if the UN is actually to be a force in the world at the moment, the Chinese really start to push, you know, a lot, because there really are only 5 permanent members: the UK, the US, Russia, China, and France at the UN Security Council. The Chinese, I think, have been kind of holding back a little bit too much. So there should be some kind of, you know, the Western oligarchy, or I say they're weak, but they're very powerful. Of course, they've got the power to kill us all. But one thing I can tell you is they don't have the power to win. And so they need to be driven back into their box, back into their cage somehow. Quite how that is achieved is a whole nother question. But these sorts of things can be thrashed out at the UN. And I think slowly but surely, You know, the UN has been criticised over the years for being too weak, but at least what they're doing is they're giving a direction to the world, and they're making it clear this is no longer about one side versus the other side. It's about right versus wrong, and it's about good versus evil. And the evildoers have to be put in their place by the rest of humanity, and I think that's what we're going to see. Catherine Austin Fitts, the famous American economist, put it very well. She said it's a war on God, and God's going to win.